The Empire's overconfidence. The Zarthian Empire was one of the greatest powers in the galaxy. Its massive fleets of warships patrolled the stars, crushing any who dared challenge their rule. Planets fell before them like leaves in the wind, and no one could stand in their way. To the Zarthians, their dominance was unquestioned. They had ruled for centuries, and their technology was unmatched. Nothing in the universe could stop them. At the heart of their power was the fleet, hundreds of warships, each bristling with weapons capable of destroying entire cities with a single shot, patrolled their empire's borders. The Empire had grown arrogant, certain that no force in the galaxy could ever challenge them. Their commanders were proud, their ships invincible. But there was one thing they hadn't expected. It all began on the edge of their empire, a region known for its silence. No ships ventured into this part of space. It was far from the centers of trade and politics, an empty stretch where no one dared to travel. It was the perfect place for a quiet, secure empire to grow complacent. That was until the first signal came. At first, the Zarthian commanders didn't take it seriously. A faint, weak signal, hardly worth noticing. But when it repeated itself, coming from deeper into the empty space, something shifted. The Empire's sensors detected a strange, unfamiliar signal, unlike anything they had ever encountered. It was faint, but it was there. They couldn't ignore it. A single ship traveling through the emptiness. At first, they thought it was a simple scout ship, perhaps a trading vessel or a lost explorer, but no one dared to approach. The Empire's arrogance made them feel secure in their control of the galaxy. They had thousands of ships, and none of them could be touched by any insignificant force. The thought of one tiny ship from a primitive species, such as humanity, even posing a threat was laughable. Still, the Empire's commanders ordered a small fleet to investigate. They didn't take it seriously, but they felt the need to send a few ships to see what was going on. These were elite warships, part of a force that had crushed countless rebellions in the past. Their commanders were confident. After all, nothing in the universe could stand against the might of the Zarthian Empire. As the fleet neared the signal's origin, they discovered something unexpected. The ship was human, a vessel of humanity's creation. To the Zarthians, it was just another surprise. Humanity was a small, insignificant species. They had barely been able to develop space travel. The Zarthian commanders laughed. What could one human ship do? With an arrogant chuckle, the commanders sent their forces forward, preparing to wipe out this tiny, pathetic challenge. They were sure it would be a simple task. After all, how could one small ship, outnumbered and outgunned, pose any real threat to the mighty Empire? The human ship, meanwhile, approached the Empire's fleet with quiet confidence. It was sleek and fast, but nothing about it screamed dangerous. The Zarthians saw only one ship, and they believed it would be an easy victory. The human captain, however, knew that appearances could be deceiving. Captain Sarah Matthews, a seasoned leader of humanity's best crew, understood the stakes. This wasn't about fighting for land or power. This was about survival. The fate of humanity rested on this single ship. She had trained her crew for years for this exact moment, though none of them expected it to come so soon. The Zarthian fleet did not realize this. To them, it was another easy conquest. They were used to victories without effort. Their warships had destroyed planets before. This human ship, with its single crew and small arsenal, wouldn't stand a chance against their vast, powerful fleet. The Zarthian warships were massive, with thousands of soldiers and advanced weaponry. Their fleet had crushed entire civilizations, and their name alone was enough to send shivers down the spines of the galaxy's lesser species. They had seen it all, and they knew how to defeat any enemy. But they had never faced an enemy like this. The Empire had underestimated humanity. They had no idea what one human ship was capable of. As the two forces closed in on each other, the Zarthian commanders prepared to launch their attack. They moved with cold precision, their ships ready for battle. There was no doubt in their minds that this would be an easy fight. The human ship was outmatched and outnumbered, and they knew they would crush it without hesitation. But the human ship, the Phantom, was prepared in ways the Zarthian fleet couldn't possibly imagine. The crew, led by Captain Matthews, knew that one mistake could cost them everything. But they also knew that if they could survive this first clash, they could change the tide of the war. The Zarthians may have underestimated them, but humanity had one thing the Empire lacked: the ability to adapt. The Zarthians, confident in their power, prepared for the battle they believed would be nothing more than a formality. The humans, on the other hand, were preparing for a fight that would change the fate of the galaxy forever. As both sides closed in, the tension in the void was palpable. The Empire's fleet was ready to unleash its fury, while the human ship stood firm, preparing to prove that even one ship could stand against the power of an empire. The Empire's overconfidence would soon come to haunt them, and they didn't even realize it yet. The silence of space was broken by the hum of engines. The Zarthian fleet moved in perfect formation, a terrifying array of warships that could decimate entire star systems with a single strike. Their weapons were locked and ready, and the commanders stood by, confident that this encounter would be just another easy victory in their long history of dominance. Captain Sarah Matthews stood on the bridge of the Phantom, her hand steady as she looked out at the advancing fleet. The tension was palpable, but her expression was calm. She had trained for this moment her entire career, and she knew her crew was ready. One ship against an entire empire, the odds were almost impossible. But Sarah Matthews believed in her crew, in the humans who had trained and fought together through countless simulations and real-life scenarios. She believed they could do the impossible. "Captain, the enemy fleet is closing in," the communications officer said, his voice calm but with a slight edge of anxiety. "They're almost within range." Sarah nodded, glancing at the tactical display. The Zarthian fleet was massive. At least a dozen ships, each larger and more powerful than the Phantom. The distance between them was quickly closing, and in the vastness of space, it was only a matter of moments before the battle would begin. "We're ready," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "Prepare all systems for combat. We need to be quick, decisive, and above all, unpredictable. Let's make sure they regret ever underestimating us." The crew moved into action, their training taking over. The engineers worked frantically, making last-minute adjustments to the ship's systems. The weapons officers prepared the ship's main cannons, ensuring they would hit their targets with deadly precision. The navigator, a young woman named Alia, plotted the ship's course to make sure they could dodge the first volley of fire from the Zarthians. "We've got one shot at this," Sarah thought to herself. Just one shot. She didn't look at the Zarthian fleet directly. Instead, her gaze shifted to the stars. She thought about Earth, about all of humanity, and how they had been fighting for survival ever since they had made contact with the alien species that dominated the galaxy. The humans were not the strongest, nor the most advanced, but they had something that the Zarthians had never been able to understand: the will to fight, to survive, and the will to make sure they were never enslaved again. "We're almost within range," Alia called out from the navigation station. "What's the plan, Captain?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "We'll take out their flagship first. It's the largest, and it's the command center of the fleet. If we can eliminate their leadership, the rest will fall apart. Once we've done that, we'll break off and engage the rest of the fleet with hit-and-run tactics." The Zarthians were used to overwhelming their enemies with sheer force. But the Phantom was fast and nimble. Its speed was its greatest asset. Sarah knew if they could stay mobile, the Zarthians' heavy firepower would be ineffective. It was their best chance to survive. "Target locked," the weapons officer, Lieutenant Clark, called out. "Fire on my mark," Sarah said, her hand hovering over the command console. The Zarthian fleet was closing in rapidly. It was only a matter of time before they opened fire. Sarah didn't wait for them to make the first move. "Now," she ordered. The Phantom's main guns erupted with powerful energy blasts, slicing through the darkness of space. The first shot hit one of the Zarthian warships, causing a massive explosion. The ship's shields were strong, but the direct hit still caused significant damage. The blast sent shockwaves through the fleet. The Zarthian commanders were taken by surprise. They had expected the human ship to hesitate, to be cautious. But instead, they were met with swift, brutal force. The Zarthians immediately began to retaliate, launching their own energy blasts. But the Phantom was already moving. "Evasive maneuvers, now," Sarah shouted. The Phantom swerved to the left, narrowly avoiding the incoming fire. The Zarthian ships weren't used to fighting something so unpredictable. Their fire missed its target, and Sarah's ship flew into the chaos, weaving in and out of the larger ships, a shadow in the void. "Lock on the flagship's weak spot," Sarah said. "Target the engines and their central command core." The Zarthian flagship loomed large in front of them, a massive ship with enormous weapons. It was an imposing sight, but it was also its greatest weakness. Its engines and central systems were exposed, and if they could strike those, the flagship would be crippled. The Phantom's weapons targeted the weak spot with pinpoint accuracy, unleashing another devastating blast. This time, the attack hit its mark. The flagship shuddered, its shields flickering as explosions rocked its hull. The Zarthians aboard the ship scrambled. But it was too late. The flagship's engines went dark, and the massive ship slowed to a crawl. "We've done it," Lieutenant Clark yelled. "Their flagship is disabled." But Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The rest of the fleet wouldn't give up so easily. They would come at them with everything they had. The real battle was about to begin. "Don't celebrate yet," Sarah warned her crew. "We've got a long way to go before this is over. Prepare for the next phase. We need to hit them hard while they're confused." The Zarthians were panicking. Their pride had been shattered in a matter of minutes. They had expected an easy victory, but now, a single human ship had crippled their flagship and thrown their entire fleet into disarray. The Empire's overconfidence had blinded them to the one thing they never saw coming: the relentless spirit of humanity. And that was only the beginning. As Sarah Matthews steered the Phantom toward the next phase of their attack, she knew that this battle would change everything. The Empire might have thought it was invincible, but humanity was about to show them just how wrong they were. The Zarthian fleet was reeling. Their flagship, the heart of their force, had been crippled by a single precise strike from the human ship. Panic spread among the remaining warships as the humans' audacity struck at the core of the Zarthian Empire's pride. Yet, the Zarthian commanders weren't about to be defeated so easily. Anger and humiliation quickly turned to vengeance. They had underestimated humanity before, but that mistake would not be repeated. In the chaos that followed, Zarthian battle leaders rallied their forces, issuing orders with a newfound urgency. A new strategy was quickly formed. The remaining warships began to converge, forming a tightly knit formation designed to overwhelm the Phantom with sheer firepower. They would close the gap quickly, trapping the human ship in a deadly circle of death. On the bridge of the Phantom, Captain Sarah Matthews stood firm, watching the movement of the enemy ships on the tactical display. She knew they wouldn't remain disorganized for long. The Zarthians were calculating creatures, quick to learn from their mistakes. She had expected a counterattack, but what she didn't expect was the swiftness and precision of their response. "They're regrouping, Captain," Lieutenant Clark said, his voice grim as he scanned the tactical readout. "They're going to come at us in a coordinated attack. Time to teach them what it means to underestimate us," Sarah muttered under her breath, her mind racing. She had to think fast. If the Zarthians closed in on them, the Phantom would be outgunned, and no amount of speed would help them avoid certain destruction. "Alia, plot an evasive course. Get us out of their line of fire," Sarah ordered, her eyes locked onto the screen. "We need to make them think we're retreating." "Aye, Captain," Alia replied, her fingers flying over the controls as she swiftly changed their course. The ship veered left, darting away from the approaching fleet. But the Zarthians weren't fooled. They had been caught off guard by the Phantom's surprise attack, but now Their pride and anger drove them forward with relentless speed. They would not make the same mistake twice. Sarah could see the incoming barrage of fire. The Zarthians were closing in fast, and their weapons were charging for a deadly strike. "Brace for impact," Sarah shouted, knowing there was no time to evade the attack entirely. The ship's shields flared as the first volley of energy blasts slammed into the Phantom's hull, sending violent tremors through the entire ship. The sound of alarms filled the bridge, and the crew braced themselves as they fought to keep the ship from being torn apart. "Shields holding at 60%, the engineer reported, his voice trained but determined. "Good. Keep them up as long as you can," Sarah said, though she knew it wouldn't be enough. The Phantom was fast, but it couldn't outrun a dozen ships all firing simultaneously. They had to take the initiative, strike hard, and strike first. "Lieutenant Clark, can we take out their lead ship?" Sarah asked, her gaze fixed on the largest Zarthian warship in the fleet. It was leading the charge, and if they could destroy it, the rest of the fleet would fall into disarray again. Clark analyzed the readout. "We have a shot, but we need a clean hit. Their shields are strong, but their engine core is exposed." "Do it," Sarah ordered. Clark turned to the weapons officer. "Fire on my mark. Target the engine core." The hum of the energy weapons filled the air as the Phantom began to veer towards the lead Zarthian ship. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she prepared for the strike. They couldn't afford to miss. "Steady," Sarah muttered under her breath, watching as the distance between the two ships closed. The Zarthians were too confident in their numerical superiority. They thought one ship couldn't possibly pose a serious threat. The Zarthian lead ship continued its relentless advance, unaware that the human ship was closing in for another surprise attack. "Now," Clark barked. The cannon fire tore through the space between them, the energy blast screaming towards the Zarthian warship's engine core. There was a moment of silence as everyone on the bridge held their breath, hoping against all odds that the strike would land true. Then, the explosion. The Zarthian flagship erupted into a brilliant burst of light, followed by a massive shockwave that rippled through space. The ship's core detonated, and the remnants of its once proud form disintegrated in an instant. The blast was so powerful that even the smaller Zarthian ships were shaken by the force, momentarily losing their coordination. "We got it," Lieutenant Clark shouted, his voice filled with disbelief. But Sarah wasn't celebrating yet. She knew the battle wasn't over. The Zarthian fleet was still strong, and they would be quick to regroup. "Prepare for the next wave," she ordered, her voice sharp. "They'll be angrier now. We've got to keep them off balance." And true to her prediction, the Zarthian fleet didn't hesitate for long. Their response was immediate and furious. Several smaller ships broke away from the main formation, splitting off to flank the Phantom from different angles. The remaining warships opened fire again, their weapons charging for another deadly round. "We're not out of this yet," Sarah muttered, gripping the armrests of her chair. "This is just getting started." The fight had only just begun. The Zarthian fleet might have lost their flagship, but they were far from defeated. And the Phantom, though battered and scarred, still had one last trick up its sleeve. "Alia, give me a jump to the right." "Now," Sarah commanded. As the crew sprang into action, Sarah's mind raced. They had to keep the pressure on. Keep moving. Keep the Zarthians guessing. And most importantly, never give up. The battle raged on, but one thing was certain. The Zarthian Empire was no longer as confident as they had been when they first encountered the human ship. And that fear, that uncertainty, was their greatest weakness. The battle raged on, with the Zarthian fleet determined to crush the Phantom and avenge the destruction of their flagship. But the humans aboard the ship had proven something that the Zarthians couldn't ignore. One ship, against all odds, could strike fear into an entire empire. On the bridge of the Phantom, Captain Sarah Matthews watched as her crew worked tirelessly. The ship was damaged, but its crew had the strength to fight on. The Zarthians had already thrown everything they had at them, but now the humans were preparing to turn the tables once more. "We're outgunned, Captain," Lieutenant Clark said, his voice tight with tension. "They've split off into smaller groups and are attempting to encircle us. Their numbers are overwhelming." "Not for long," Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the battlefield. The Zarthians had underestimated the Phantom before, and now it was time for them to make the same mistake again. If they were going to win, they would have to outsmart the Zarthians, not outgun them. "Alia, prepare for evasive maneuvers. We need to get in close to those smaller ships. It's our only chance," Sarah ordered. "Aye, Captain." Alia responded quickly, her fingers moving over the controls. The Zarthian fleet was relentless. As they closed in on the Phantom, they sent wave after wave of laser blasts and missile strikes. The ship shuddered under the bombardment, but its shields held, though barely. Sarah could feel the strain in her bones, the weight of their situation bearing down on her. The ship might have been damaged, but they still had one advantage. The Phantom was fast and unpredictable, something the Zarthians were still learning to cope with. "Shields are at 30%, the engineer reported, his voice frantic. "We can't take much more of this, Captain." "Hold on," Sarah shouted, her grip tightening on the chair. "Alia, give us a hard left now." With lightning speed, Alia maneuvered the Phantom into a sharp turn, narrowly avoiding a direct hit. The ship's engines roared as they fired once more, slipping out of the Zarthians' crossfire just in time. The Zarthian ships, now frustrated, followed, but the humans were making them work for every shot. The Phantom weaved through the chaos of laser fire, using the debris from the battle and the unpredictable movement of the Zarthian ships as cover. Their strategy was to confuse the enemy, to make them second-guess their every move. The Zarthians had relied on their overwhelming numbers, but that was starting to work against them. The human ship was agile, elusive, and unpredictable. The larger Zarthian ships were now struggling to track their target. Then Sarah saw it, the perfect opening. "Lieutenant Clark, do we have a shot at the Zarthian command cruiser?" she asked, her mind racing. Clark's eyes flicked to the sensor display, calculating the trajectory. "We do, but the angle's tight. We'll need to use our remaining power to boost the cannon." "Do it," Sarah commanded, her voice calm but firm. Clark gave the order, and the weapons officer started charging up the cannon. The tension in the air was palpable. The Phantom had been under constant fire for what seemed like hours, and they were running low on power. But if they could disable the Zarthian command cruiser, they might just have a shot at turning the tide in their favor. The ship's hull groaned as it surged forward, and the weapon's energy cannons glowed bright, preparing for their shot. The Zarthian fleet was still closing in, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. The humans had moved fast, too fast for the Zarthian fleet to track. Firing in 3, 2, 1. Clark counted down, his finger poised over the button. Fire. The cannon discharged with a burst of energy, sending a concentrated blast towards the Zarthian command cruiser. The shot ripped through the void, its trajectory perfect. The Zarthian command cruiser tried to evasively maneuver, but it was too late. The blast struck directly at the ship's engine core, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then the explosion. The command cruiser shattered into pieces, its remnants scattering across the battlefield in a brilliant display of fire and light. The shockwave rippled through the remaining Zarthian fleet, throwing several ships off course. The loss of their command ship threw the Zarthians into disarray. Direct hit. Clark cheered, a momentary burst of excitement breaking through the tension. But Sarah didn't allow herself to relax. She knew better than anyone that the Zarthians would retaliate with all their might. "They're going to come for us harder now," Sarah said, her face hardening. "Prepare for another round. We can't let up." The Zarthian fleet was now in disarray, but their determination and thirst for revenge hadn't faded. Even without their command ship, they were still formidable. The Phantom was beginning to feel the toll of the battle. The ship was battered, but it wasn't broken. "Prepare to jump to full throttle," Sarah ordered. "We're not done yet." In the distance, the Zarthians regrouped, their fleet shifting positions, ready to strike again. But Sarah Matthews had proven something. One ship was enough. And that ship had just begun to show the galaxy that humans were not to be underestimated. "Hold fast," Sarah muttered to herself, staring out at the swirling chaos of the battlefield. This is far from over. The Zarthian fleet was recovering quickly. Despite the devastating loss of their command cruiser, they were not an empire that easily crumbled. The Phantom was battered, its shields weak, and its hull full of dents and cracks from the onslaught. But its crew was still determined to fight. Captain Sarah Matthews stood at the helm, watching the sensor readings, knowing the battle wasn't over yet. The Zarthians were closing in, reforming into a new formation that seemed even more organized than before. They were learning. The Phantom had caused chaos, but the Zarthians had now adjusted, and the weight of their numbers was beginning to show. "They've regrouped. They're coming at us with everything they have," Clark said, his eyes glued to the redouts. "I don't think we can take much more." Sarah clenched her fists, frustration building. Every part of her told her to keep going, to push forward, and give it everything. But she knew they had to be careful. One wrong move, and it could all be over. "We have one shot," Sarah said, her voice firm but calm. "We can't keep dodging forever. We need to strike before they get too close." She glanced over to Alia, who was working feverishly on the controls. "Can you reprogram the engines to divert power to the main cannon?" Sarah asked. Alia nodded, her eyes narrowing. "It's risky, but it might work. If we can get the angle right, we can hit their flagship and take out their command structure entirely." "Do it," Sarah ordered. With a sharp nod, Alia's fingers flew over the console, and the ship's engine whined in protest as energy was rerouted. The hum of the ship changed, a deeper vibration that seemed to echo through the hull. The crew knew what it meant. This was their last chance. Sarah's heart raced as the countdown began. The Zarthian fleet was closing in fast, but the crew of the Phantom had one advantage. They knew the Zarthians better than the Zarthians knew themselves. The humans had studied the enemy for months, preparing for a battle like this. And now, with the ship barely holding together, they would strike where it hurt most. The Zarthians were in range, their weapons charging, ready to deliver the final blow. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She could see their ships lining up in perfect formation, preparing to unleash everything. She knew they wouldn't expect the Phantom to make such a desperate move. "Alia, now," Sarah barked. The ship lurched forward, the cannon primed and charged. The energy field around the Phantom flickered for a moment as the power drain from the rerouted engines took its toll, but it held steady. The Zarthian ships were so close now, too close. Their missiles were almost on target. But Sarah Matthews had played her hand carefully. She had baited them into this position, and now they were falling into the trap. Firing in 3, 2, 1. Alia counted down, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Fire!" The main cannon on the Phantom roared to life. A bright beam of energy shot out, cutting through the battlefield with deadly precision. The beam slammed into the heart of the Zarthian flagship, hitting it squarely in its power core. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, a massive explosion erupted. The shockwave tore through the battlefield. Zarthian ships were thrown off course by the force, their shields buckling under the power of the blast. The flagship, once the symbol of Zarthian superiority, was now nothing but wreckage. A huge fireball lit up the space, and smaller debris began to rain down, creating a dazzling yet deadly display of destruction. "Direct hit," Clark shouted, his voice full of disbelief. "It worked. We took down their flagship." But Sarah didn't celebrate yet. The Zarthian fleet had suffered a crippling blow, but it wasn't over. They were still a dangerous force, and without their flagship, they were going to be desperate. Desperate enemies were always the most dangerous. "We've done it," Alia said quietly, but Sarah could see the tension still in her eyes. But they're not giving up. The Zarthian fleet had regrouped, and they were coming at the Phantom with renewed rage. The loss of their flagship had made them even more unpredictable. Now, it wasn't just about winning. It was about surviving. Sarah clenched her jaw. She had no doubt that the Zarthians would come at them with everything they had, no matter what. But now, the tables had turned. The Phantom had proven something. The Zarthians were not invincible, and the Phantom wasn't the only ship in the galaxy capable of making them bleed. "This is far from over," Sarah said, determination flooding her veins. "But they've learned something today." Alia nodded. "What's that?" "Never underestimate humanity," Sarah replied with a steely gaze, her mind already calculating the next move. "Because we're not done yet." The battle wasn't won, but the Zarthians had learned one thing that would echo throughout the galaxy. One human ship, against all odds, could strike fear into the heart of an empire. And the Zarthians were about to find out just how much more humanity had left to give. The Zarthians had regrouped, their surviving ships now formed in a tight, organized line. They were furious, and the rage in their eyes was clear even from the viewports. Losing their flagship was more than just a blow to their pride. It was a direct attack on their power. And the Zarthians were not the type to accept defeat quietly. The Phantom was barely holding together. The ship was now running on limited power, and the crew could feel the strain. Every panel in the command room was flickering with warning signs, and the hum of the engines sounded weak, as though they could give out at any moment. But Sarah Matthews didn't flinch. The crew had done the impossible. They had crippled the Zarthian flagship, but now they had to face the full wrath of the fleet. "We've only got one chance," Sarah said, her voice calm but intense. "If we don't act fast, they'll overwhelm us. We need to keep them on the defensive." Clark, his eyes scanning the radar, turned to her with a grim expression. "There's no time. They're already moving in." The Zarthian ships were closing in fast. They had learned from their earlier mistakes, and now they were taking no chances. The Phantom was in their sights, and the Zarthians were preparing to unleash everything they had left. Sarah's mind raced. They had to find a way to turn the tables once again. "Alia," Sarah called out, "can you reroute the remaining power to the secondary weapon systems? We need a surprise strike." Alia's fingers danced over the controls, but her face was drawn with exhaustion. "It's risky. The ship can barely handle it, but I'll try." Sarah watched her crew work, their faces lit by the dim glow of the control panels. They were battered, bruised, and exhausted, but they were still a team. The Phantom may have been a single ship, but it was a ship that represented more than just technology. It was the resolve and determination of every human who had ever dared to defy the odds. The Zarthian ships were now within range. Their weapons were charging, their final push coming fast. The Phantom had little time left before they would be hit with everything the Zarthians had. "We can't outrun them," Clark said, his voice tight with concern. "And we can't keep dodging either. We'll have to hit them first." Sarah nodded, her jaw clenched. "Get ready. Alia, give it everything you've got." The ship shook slightly as the last of the power was diverted from the engines to the secondary weapons. A low, pulsing hum filled the command room as the ship's remaining energy was concentrated into the weapon systems. The Zarthian fleet was closing in, their weapons charging, ready to strike. It was a terrifying moment. Sarah knew that once the Zarthians fired, they wouldn't stop. The Phantom would be destroyed in an instant. "Now," Sarah shouted. Alia hit the button, and the ship's secondary weapon systems fired with a force that rocked the entire ship. A series of powerful, concentrated blasts shot out from the sides of the Phantom, catching the Zarthian fleet off guard. The Zarthians had expected another direct assault, but this time, humanity wasn't playing by the rules. The blasts hit several of the Zarthian ships head-on, and a massive explosion lit up the space around them. The Zarthians had underestimated the sheer power and unpredictability of the Phantom, and it showed. The surprise attack threw their entire formation into chaos. Ships were sent spinning, some losing all power and drifting helplessly in space. The Zarthians weren't just shaken. They were reeling. Sarah watched, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. The Phantom had struck once again, and it had thrown the Zarthian fleet into disarray. For a brief moment, the Zarthians were no longer the unstoppable force they had once seemed. They were vulnerable. But Sarah knew this wouldn't last. The Zarthians were quick to adapt. They would recover and regroup, and the next wave of attack would come even harder. She had only one advantage: time. The Phantom needed to take advantage of this chaos to get away, to find a way to regroup and prepare for the next phase of the battle. "Now's our chance," Sarah said, her voice steady but full of urgency. "Alia, get us out of here. Full speed ahead." Alia's fingers flew over the controls, and the ship jerked forward, engines roaring back to life. The Phantom surged through the debris of the Zarthian fleet, narrowly avoiding the wreckage of the destroyed ships. "We're out of range," Clark said, his voice filled with relief. "For now." Sarah took a deep breath, her hands gripping the controls tightly. The battle was far from over, but they had survived the worst of it. They had struck a blow that the Zarthians would never forget. But the truth was clear now. Humanity was not to be underestimated. They were more than just a single ship. They were a symbol of defiance, of strength against impossible odds. "We've given them a taste of what's to come," Sarah said, her voice calm and sure. "But they're not finished. And neither are we." The Zarthian Empire had learned something today. They had underestimated humanity. And the Phantom was only the beginning. As the ship moved further away from the wreckage of the battle, Sarah Matthews knew that the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. The universe had just been introduced to a new kind of power, and humanity had just begun to make its mark. The battle was not over. Despite the damage, the Zarthians were not giving up. The Phantom had made it out of the immediate danger zone, but the Zarthian fleet was regathering. They were more determined than ever to crush the lone human ship that had dared to challenge their dominance. But Sarah Matthews and her crew were not ready to surrender. They had come this far, and they would not back down now. The crew gathered in the command room once again, their faces grim but resolute. Their bodies were tired, their ship barely functional, but there was no other choice. The Zarthian fleet was closing in, and the Phantom was the only thing standing between humanity and complete destruction. They had no allies, no reinforcements, just themselves, their ship, and their will to survive. "Sarah," Clark said, his voice low, "we're running out of options. The Zarthians have regrouped, and they're sending everything they've got. If we don't stop them now, there won't be anything left." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes unwavering. "We've been underestimated before. Let's give them one final surprise." Her voice was calm, but her words carried a heavy weight. The crew knew that this would be their last stand. There would be no retreat, no escape. The Phantom was all they had, and they would use it to the fullest. They would take down the Zarthians, or go down trying. Alia, her face set in determination, spoke up. "I've been working on a last-ditch plan. If we overload the primary engines and funnel the energy into the weapons systems, we can launch a final strike powerful enough to take out their entire fleet. But the ship won't survive. We'll have one shot." Sarah took a deep breath. The risk was enormous. The Phantom might not survive the final attack, but they had no other choice. This was humanity's chance to make sure the Zarthians would never threaten the galaxy again. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked, her mind racing with the plan. "Not long," Alia replied. "The Zarthian fleet is less than 2 hours away." "All right," Sarah said. "Prepare the ship for the overload. Let's give them everything we've got." The crew went to work, each person moving quickly, but carefully. They knew what this meant. The Phantom would be pushed to its absolute limits, and the odds of surviving were slim. But they were ready. They had come this far, and they would not stop. As the final moments approached, Sarah stood in front of the command console, her eyes fixed on the screen. The Zarthian fleet was getting closer, and she could feel the tension in the air. There was no turning back now. It was all or nothing. "Alia," Sarah said softly, "are we ready?" Alia nodded, her fingers hovering over the controls. "Ready." "Do it," Sarah ordered. With that, the ship shuddered as the power surged through its core. The Phantom's engines hummed louder than they had ever done before, straining against the overload. The weapons systems came online, the energy from the engines now coursing into the ship's arsenal. The blast that was about to be unleashed would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Zarthian fleet was closing in fast. They had no idea what was coming. They thought they had already defeated humanity, but they had no idea what one human ship was capable of. The Phantom's cannons locked onto the Zarthian ships, and Sarah Matthews took a deep breath. Here we go. The ship's weapons fired with a deafening roar. The blast was so powerful that it seemed to tear through the very fabric of space itself. The energy coursed through the void, hitting the Zarthian ships with a force they couldn't have anticipated. The first few ships were obliterated in an instant, their massive forms disintegrating into nothingness. The remaining Zarthian ships tried to retaliate, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The shockwave from the blast reverberated through the Zarthian fleet, causing chaos and destruction. The once feared empire was falling apart before their very eyes. Their ships were spinning out of control, their weapons firing wildly. They had never expected a single ship, a ship that was barely holding together, to be capable of such destruction. As the final ship in the Zarthian fleet crumpled under the assault, Sarah's voice rang out through the comms system. "Mission accomplished. The galaxy is safe." But there was no joy in her voice. The Phantom had done the impossible. It had defeated an entire fleet, but the cost had been great. The ship was crippled, and the crew had pushed themselves beyond their limits. There was no way to repair the damage in time to escape. Sarah turned to her crew, who were all gathered around, their faces a mix of exhaustion and triumph. They had done it. They had taken down an empire. "We did it," Clark said softly, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded, her face grim. "Yes, we did. But we paid the price." The Phantom was no longer a weapon of war. It was a symbol of what humanity was capable of. Against all odds, against an empire that had seemed invincible, humanity had stood its ground. And as Sarah looked at the stars outside, she knew this was just the beginning. The galaxy would never forget the ship that took down an empire, and the humans who had dared to defy the odds. Humanity had proven its place in the universe, and no one would ever forget it. As the last remnants of the Zarthian fleet drifted into the silence of space, Sarah Matthews and her crew knew one thing for certain. They had made their mark on the galaxy, and no one would ever again underestimate humanity.